The lesson for the 24th is done. It is going to be on the armor of God from Ephesians chapter 6. That will be our last lesson in Ephesians. So we're down to the last two lessons. And then we're going to be going to Numbers and Deuteronomy. And it's not an effort to be exhaustive in those books of the law, but it will be some good practical lessons gleaned from the Pentateuch. All right, so that's where we'll be headed. I'm sure we'll take a break around Christmas time for the Christmas story. All right. Yes, Christ in Leviticus. That's what we'll talk about. All right, certainly next week you want to take some time to talk about our day of prayer, explain, last chance for them to get any additions on your class prayer list for the day of prayer. Have them sign up, make sure that they know exactly how to do that.
On Sunday afternoon, because it will be
Finalized?
Yeah,
okay.
By that point, it will be finalized.
Okay, so if you become aware of new prayer requests that you need to add to your class, do that before the weekend to get it done the end of the week if somebody wants to add a name. Otherwise, it will be finalized and that will be printed for everybody's distribution on Sunday. Okay, good. All right, this week, after you promote the 24 hours of prayer, encourage everybody to get involved and keep them investing and inviting people the last week leading up to Neighbor Day. Also, try to encourage your folks, if they're regular faithful members, to be part of the meal team. We just need everybody to bring their food. We're expecting a lot of guests, and we want to provide for them and not have them worry about whether or not they need to bring anything. We should have plenty of food if everybody participates. All right, related to this lesson, really it's kind of a continuation of today's lesson in that I find it extremely interesting that in Ephesians 5:18, where we talk about being filled with the Spirit, following that in verse 19 and following, all the way down to chapter 6 and verse 4, which this lesson goes through, it's all results of being Spirit-filled. And so we looked at some of that today, singing to yourselves in psalms and hymns, spiritual songs, that, and then being thankful, and then verse 21, mutually submitting one to another. And so with that theme, Paul picks up with continuing what it looks like if a Christian is really Spirit-filled. But he does that in the context of family. And so you'll see the principles there following the objective statement. Every Christian should have genuine love in their relationships by applying these biblical principles, and we'll highlight those. What's interesting is you need to know that the Roman society, like the Jews, they were monogamous in their marriages, and the Roman Empire considered the family as the building block of society. And that's really where some of our Judeo-Christian ethics come in, even in the founding of our nation, patterning it a lot after the Roman Empire's attitude. But it was a paternal society, which means the men had a dominant position. However, the women in the Roman Empire were certainly being treated better than any other previous empire had treated women. In fact, you'll see my note at the top of the second page. I included this because I thought it's cute, but the Roman historian Herodotus wrote, "We Romans who rule all men are ruled by our women." That's pretty much the way it is, isn't it? Yeah. So anyway, that transitions into this backdrop of social institutions of the family as we approach Ephesians 5 for today's lesson. Okay, the first principle, quickly, is the idea that for wives, love towards your husband. Now, this is really related to, and this is what I want you to emphasize. Emphasize verse 21, because that's where we talk about we are to submitting yourselves one to another in the fear of the Lord, fear of God. And then right on the heels of that, it says, wives, submit to your own husbands. And so it's this idea of mutual submission, and then in a good family relationship, the wife chooses to submit to her own husband. And that's why the whole idea of submission in both those verses is voluntary. It does not apply to women. They're not supposed to submit to other men other than their husbands. This is within the family unit of women. Wives, submit to your own husbands. Okay? So it is not in any way a denigration of women. It's just a voluntary submission in the function of the family.
Explain voluntary.
It's a command as far as the words here, but the wife is understanding the role within the context of the family, and she's voluntarily submitting to that relationship.
As opposed to being forced to do so.
Correct. Yeah. In fact, I have statements in here that if a husband in some context would force his wife to do ungodly and sinful things, she does not have to submit to that. In fact, it would be wrong for her to do so. It's wrong of the husband to not keep her spotless in some of those things.
Brother Wade, I've been married a few years.
Yes, you have.
I have found out one great truth. If I'm submitting to the Lord, I have no problem with my wife.
Yep. Absolutely right. And instead of profound. All right. The second bullet then, submission in the home reflects the relationship between Jesus and his churches. Paul stated that the church is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church. Now, this is beyond the scope of the lesson, but you need to understand, a lot of times Ephesians chapter 5 and the whole context of Jesus is the head of the church. There are a lot of people who run to this passage and prove or try to prove the idea of the church being this worldwide, invisible, universal church. And that is absolutely not true. And the point of it is, this letter, as we've been studying the entire time, was written to a local church. And when Paul wrote to the church at Ephesus, he's telling them all of these things, and that's what he's saying. Christ is the head of the church. Well, he was talking about a local church. And then that letter was passed around to other local churches, and they gleaned the insights and inspiration of what Paul was sharing with them. So don't let someone say, oh, this teaches the generic use of the word church. No, it's a specific word for church, but it's a letter to that local church. And so that's something to keep in mind.
It still means assembly.
It does. Yep. Can't get away from the idea of assembly being visible and assembling. And congregation is another good word that speaks to the issue of assembly. Okay? Very good. All right. But the reason why the wife is submissive to the husband is because she understands that just as Christ is the Savior of the body, talking about the local body, the church, it's important that both husband and wife realize Jesus is the Savior of both of them. Okay? And so there's this beautiful picture of the gospel, really, that Jesus is the head of the church as the husband is the head of the home. All right, so you can deal with that, the fact that the church is then subject to Christ. That's a pattern and model for this voluntary submission within the family. All right. Again, that's the point in this next little paragraph part where it talks about the wife should not submit to their husbands in they should submit to their husbands in everything, but it doesn't use the word obey there. We talk about obey when we're talking about the children in 6:1-4. The word obey is there. In this, it's the idea of submission. And again, the wife was to submit to the husband as he submitted to Christ. And if the husband asks the wife to do sinful behaviors or actions, then that is where she is no longer required or to be victimized in that situation by submitting to her husband that's being ungodly in his leadership. All right, husbands, love your wives. It's interesting, and you may point it out too, but this command is for the husbands to love the wife. The husband is to love their wife. it doesn't say the wife is to love the husband. It says the wife is to submit to her husband, but the husband is commanded to love his wife. Now, there's other verses where we could point out love, in a marriage relationship.
Verse 33 says she's to reverence her husband.
Yeah, which is, again, the idea of her submitting willfully, recognizing his role as the head. Okay, you'll see this as you develop it, that the love is the pattern after the way Jesus loved his church. He gave himself for it. And that's really part of this sacrificial love. We want to examine the role of the husband with the wife. It's a role of sacrificial. It's a call for the husband to die to himself as he serves his wife. The purpose of Christ's death related to the churches was to sanctify it. That's a role of a husband to his wife. He's to sanctify her. In other words, set her apart, make her just like Jesus died for his churches. The husband is to have that kind of relationship with his wife and sanctify her, just as Jesus wanted to cleanse it, make it suitable for him. So the loving husband also desires to keep his wife clean from the impact of sin in the world. All right. So the analogy there is very beautiful, of Christ as the head of the church. But again, emphasize this. The husband is the head of the body as Christ is the head of the church. But you don't have a head without a body. You don't have a body without a head. They're not in competition. They are in union to make a complete body. And so that's a very significant part of this whole idea. And if a husband who loves his wife in turn loves himself, then he's going to nourish himself, he's going to cherish himself, and he's also going to have that attitude towards his wife. All right, and then the last point which you do want to develop is the whole idea of parents' love toward their children. This does use the word obey related to children, and it's specifically related to the fifth commandment. It quotes the fifth commandment that children are to obey their parents in the Lord, for this is right. It's the first commandment with promise, right? And so there's this issue of children are to submit to both mom and dad, and they're to obey. And this is what God set as a pattern from the very beginning with the fifth commandment, and it's a commandment with promise that they'll live long upon the earth if they obey their parents. There's also that interesting dynamic here, though, where it talks about in verse 4 that fathers in particular are not to provoke their children to wrath. This is the idea, and it's absolutely practical for every one of us as dads. We shouldn't provoke or exacerbate or exasperate our children. If we make promises, we should try to keep those promises. If we give them commandments, it should be done in a loving way, but don't change the rules on them. I mean, there's frustration and exacerbation if you're a father who provokes his children unto wrath. And so this is a very important part of it. And then both parents are to raise their children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Great opportunity for you to tell the parents in your class, this is why we want you to bring your kids to church. We want to be part of that aspect of nurturing and raising them with the help of the church, but it's the responsibility of the parents. But they should have their kids in church if they want the help of the church in accomplishing this. Okay? So, great opportunity for you to develop this and talk about husbands and wives and children, okay? All right, I think we'll have fun. Yes, question?